Vanishing of Carly McBride. Her remains were found in a secluded grave, but something was missing. Her hands. The chilling detail that only the killer could have known was enough to bring a murderer to justice. But who had told him? The road out past Scone, New South Wales, stretched on forever, quiet as a graveyard, with only the wind rattling through the dry brush to break the stillness. It was a Sunday morning, August 7th, 2016, when two folks out for a walk stumbled onto something that'd stick with them forever. Tucked in the thick bushes, half covered by dirt, was a shallow grave. They edged closer, stomachs turning as the stench of decay hit them like a punch. It wasn't roadkill or trash, it was worse. Bones. Human bones. Cops showed up fast, turning that lonely stretch into a crime scene humming with tension. They taped it off while forensic teams got to work, faces tight as they pulled fragile remains from the earth. Nobody said her name out loud, but it hung in the air. Carly McBride. 2 years had gone by since she vanished from Muswellbrook, leaving nothing but questions. A mom with 2 little ones, she'd headed out that day like any other, no sign of trouble. Then she was gone. Did she walk away from it all, or did someone make sure she'd never come back? Finding her was the answer her family had been begging for, but it was also the one they dreaded most. Forensic experts took over, running DNA tests to confirm what everyone felt in their gut. When the results came back, it was real. Carly wasn't coming home. Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams, her parents, had held on to hope for so long, living with the torture of not knowing if their girl was alive or gone. But when the police showed up at their door, heads bowed, they didn't need to hear it. They knew. The waiting was done, replaced by a truth that cut deep. Word spread like wildfire through the community, leaving folks stunned. But it cracked open darker questions. Who did this? Who took Carly from her kids, her parents, the life she'd been scraping to put back together? And where the hell had she been all this time? Detectives knew this wasn't some random disappearance. Whoever buried her picked that spot for a reason. Out of the way, hidden from prying eyes, it screamed planning. Someone thinking they'd never get caught. But even the slickest crooks slip up, and the cops were hell-bent on finding that slip. Forensic teams worked around the clock in the days after, sifting through dirt, looking for anything. Footprints, scraps of cloth, a shred of something to go on. Time hadn't been kind, though. 2 years washed away the easy clues. What they did figure out was Carly didn't die there. That spot was just a dump site, not where it happened. Someone had moved her, maybe hoping she'd stay lost forever. The investigators doubled back to her last known moments, September 30th, 2014. A regular day turned into a nightmare. Andrew Easton, her ex and the dad of her youngest, was the last to see her, or so he said. His story never sat right. Claimed they argued that Carly stormed off toward McDonald's on foot, but the cameras there didn't catch her. Nobody saw her on the road. It was like she'd melted into the air. Then there was Sale Kenneth Newson, her boyfriend back then. He'd been front and center after she vanished, reported her missing, joined the searches, made a big show of begging for her to come home. But something about him felt off to the cops. His grief came off like a performance. Too polished, like he was trying to prove he had nothing to hide. Underneath it, the detectives caught a whiff of something else. A guy sweating, waiting to see if his tracks were covered. With Carly's remains in hand, the police finally had their missing piece. Now it was about tracking down whoever thought they could bury her and walk away. 2 years of shadows were about to get lit up, and the story waiting on the other side was uglier than anyone could have guessed. A life interrupted. Carly McBride was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make it brighter. Born on April 14, 1983 in New South Wales, she had this spark, a laugh that pulled you in, a smile that stuck with you. Her parents, Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams, couldn't have been prouder watching their adventurous little girl grow into a fierce, stubborn woman. She loved hard, especially her kids, and fought like hell to give them the life she dreamed of. But Carly's life wasn't all light. She had her battles, and they'd end up tangling with the darkness nobody saw coming. As a teenager, Carly stumbled into rough waters. She started messing with alcohol and drugs, choices that pulled her down fast. Addiction sank its claws in deep, dragging her into a struggle that broke her family's hearts to watch. But Carly wasn't one to give up. She knew she had to claw her way out, not just for herself, but for William and Cadence, her two little anchors. By 2013, at 30 years old, she'd had enough. She checked into a rehab center, hell-bent on leaving the past behind and building something better. That's where she met Sale Kenneth Newson. Newson came off as the whole package: charismatic, smooth-talking, the kind of guy who seemed like he could lift her up. They hit it off quick, a friendship that turned into something more, something Carly thought might save her. From the outside, it looked good. She was pulling herself together, showing up for her kids, 7-year-old William and 3-year-old Cadence, pouring everything into being the mom they needed. But behind the scenes, things weren't so rosy. Her relationship with Newson was a roller coaster, loaded with jealousy and fights that left her on edge. While Carly was trying to heal, Newson carried his own baggage, controlling, quick to anger, the type to blow up over nothing. People close to her saw the warning signs, the way she'd tense up around him, how she'd watch her words when his name came up. But Carly, like so many women in messy relationships, figured she could handle it, that love meant sticking it out. By 2014, she was working on the things that really mattered, like her bond with Cadence, who lived in Muswellbrook with her dad, Andrew Easton. Even though Carly and Andrew had split, they made co-parenting work. She'd visit often, soaking up every second with her little girl. Newson drove her up there each time, a routine they'd settled into. On September 30th, 2014, it was supposed to be just another visit. He dropped her off at Andrew's place around 12:30 p.m., same as always. She'd call him when she was ready to head back, except this time she didn't. Hours went by and Newson started getting antsy. He called her, no answer. Figured her phone died, but something felt off. He drove back to Andrew's expecting to see her waiting. She wasn't there. Andrew's story didn't help settle anything. He said they'd argued, that Carly got mad and took off on foot, saying she was walking to McDonald's, a 20-minute hike. Newson drove the route, eyes peeled, but there was no sign of her. It wasn't like her to just disappear. Even if she was upset, she'd have called someone, let them know where she was. But her phone stayed quiet. A day passed, then 2. By the time Newson reported her missing, it was sinking in. She wasn't coming back. Steve and Lorraine were out of their minds with worry. They knew Carly wouldn't just walk away from her life. She loved her kids too much, had fought too hard to get clean. Weeks turned into months. Search parties scoured Muswellbrook and the surrounding bush, but nothing turned up. The cops grilled Andrew, but he stuck to his story. He didn't know where she'd gone. Then something weird came up. Carly's Facebook account got deleted the same day she vanished. Cops figured out it happened after her last sighting, but before anyone reported her missing. Who did that? Was it Carly, trying to vanish on purpose? Or someone else, wiping her slate clean? Theories started swirling. Some folks thought maybe she ran off, escaping something nobody knew about. But the people who loved her weren't having it. She was a mom with plans, dreams, a life she was fighting for, not someone who'd ditch it all. For nearly 2 years, her case sat like an open wound, a mystery that wouldn't let anyone rest. Then, in August 2016, her remains were found, pulled from the dirt like a buried secret. And with them came the cold, hard truth. This wasn't about someone disappearing. It was about something evil. The question wasn't where Carly had gone anymore. It was who'd put her there. A web of lies and deception. When Carly McBride's remains turned up in August 2016, it was like a jolt of lightning through a case that had been teetering on the edge of going cold. What started as a missing persons puzzle was now a murder investigation, no question about it. But for the detectives working the case, the road ahead was a mess of lies and half-truths. Somewhere in the jumble of stories about Carly's last hours, between the shaky alibis and contradictory accounts, was the truth. They just had to dig it out. Suspicion had been circling two men from the start, Andrew Easton and Sale Kenneth Newson. They were the last ones to see her, their stories piecing together the hazy timeline of her disappearance. But neither of their versions added up clean. Andrew swore Carly stormed out of his place on foot after a fight, pissed off and headed for McDonald's. Detectives weren't buying it. Nobody saw her walking that day. Not one witness. McDonald's cameras didn't catch a glimpse of her either. It was like she stepped out his door and vanished into thin air. Still, Andrew played ball with the cops, let them search his place, stuck to his story. If he was hiding something, where was the proof? Then there was Newson, and his behavior set off every alarm bell the investigators had. At first, he came off as the heartbroken boyfriend, reported her missing, talked to the press, joined the searches, even slapped a $20,000 reward on the table for any leads. To anyone watching, he looked like a guy torn apart, desperate to find his girl. But it didn't take long for that mask to slip. Within days of Carly disappearing, he was already sniffing around other women. 2 days after she went missing, October 2nd, he was shacked up with someone new. His social media, once full of posts about Carly, went back to normal like she'd never existed. The cops started poking harder, looking for cracks in Newson's story, and what they found sent a chill through the whole team. First off, Carly's Facebook account had been deleted, not long after she was last seen, but before she was even reported missing. Someone had logged in, scrubbed it clean, and made sure whatever was on there, messages, connections, anything, was gone for good. That wasn't random. That was someone trying to bury something. Newson had a reputation for being controlling, jealous, the kind of guy who couldn't stand not being the center of attention. Carly's friends told the cops about it, how he'd grill her over every little thing, especially if another guy was involved. Just days before she vanished, she'd gotten messages on Facebook from someone Newson didn't like. They'd fought about it. Bad. Could that have been the spark that set him off? Then came a moment that made the detective's blood run cold. Newson was on the phone with Carly's dad, Steve McBride, and out of nowhere, he dropped a detail that stopped Steve in his tracks. Said something about Carly's skeleton missing bones from her hands. Thing is, that wasn't public knowledge. Only the cops and the forensic team at John Hunter Hospital knew that. So, how the hell did Newson? It pointed to one ugly possibility. He'd seen her body before anyone else did. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. During a search of Newson's place, tucked under his bed in a shoebox, they found a hand-drawn map. It had 3 spots circled with numbers. 2 matched up with security camera locations between Muswellbrook and Scone. The third, damn near the exact spot where Carly's body was buried. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a blueprint. By then, the investigators weren't asking if Newson was involved. They were asking how much he'd planned and if he'd had help. The evidence was stacking up, but there was still a gap. The cause of death. Without it, pinning murder on him would be a slog. Then the forensic report landed like a gut punch. Carly's injuries weren't just bad, they were the stuff of nightmares. Her skull had 23 fractures, ribs smashed to pieces, spine broken in multiple places. This wasn't a scuffle gone wrong. This was someone trying to erase her from existence with pure, hateful force. When they confronted Newson, he didn't even blink. Denied it all, stone cold, like he was reading a script. Said he had nothing to do with it, that he was innocent. But the cops weren't buying it anymore. As they built their case, another name kept circling, James Cunnin. He'd been at the same rehab center as Carly and Newson, had a rap sheet as messy as Newson's, and the cops started to suspect he'd played a part in covering it up. With the evidence piling up, they made their move. In June 2017, Newson was arrested for Carly's murder. Not long after, Cunnin was hauled in, charged as an accessory. The lies were starting to come apart, and the truth, buried as deep as Carly had been, was finally clawing its way out. The trial and the unveiling of brutality. When Sale Kenneth Newson and James Cunnin were arrested, it felt like the first crack of light after nearly 3 years of darkness for the investigators working Carly McBride's case. Her fate had finally come into focus, but justice was still a long way off. The prosecution had a mountain to climb, proving beyond any doubt that Newson had murdered Carly with brutal intent and that Cunnin had helped cover it up. The courtroom turned into a battlefield where every piece of truth had to be fought for and laid bare. The trial kicked off in August 2018, and the prosecution didn't hold back. They dove straight into the gut-wrenching details of Carly's last moments, painting a picture that left the room heavy with dread. She'd been stuck in a relationship that had turned toxic, blind to the betrayal brewing in the man she thought she could trust. Newson played the part of a caring boyfriend in public, but behind closed doors, he was a ticking bomb. Witnesses came forward, one after another, talking about his jealousy, his need to control everything, the screaming matches that had marked his time with Carly. The real unraveling came with the forensic evidence. It was like peeling back a curtain to reveal a nightmare. The prosecution laid out the extent of Carly's injuries, and it wasn't just bad. It was horrific. When the forensic expert took the stand, you could feel the air get sucked out of the room. He described 23 fractures in her skull, ribs smashed to pieces, a spine broken in multiple spots. It wasn't just a beating. It was annihilation. The kind of force needed to do that wasn't something you'd expect from a random fight. It was calculated, deliberate, like whoever did it wanted to erase her completely. The judge didn't mince words, calling it incomprehensible violence. The jury got their first real look at the monster behind the crime. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment thing, not some slip-up born of passion. It was cold, planned, and full of rage, an act meant to destroy. Then there was Newson's past. He'd bragged about being a trained fighter, throwing around stories of Muay Thai and boxing, even training with world champs. It sounded like bar talk until you lined it up with Carly's injuries. The damage matched what someone with his skills could do. It wasn't hard to imagine him using that training to unleash hell on her. The prosecution argued that's exactly what happened the day she disappeared. They said Newson flipped out after learning Carly had been at her ex's place, Andrew Easton's, spending more time there than with her daughter. Jealousy took over, and he turned it into a vicious, unrelenting attack. She never had a chance. The timeline didn't help Newson's case either. Carly was last seen alive around 12:30 p.m. that day. By evening, her phone went dead. By night, her Facebook was gone, deleted. The prosecution said Newson knew what he'd done and started scrubbing any trace of her existence, thinking he could outsmart everyone. But he wasn't as clever as he thought. Investigators found a hand-drawn map in his place, pointing to spots eerily close to where Carly's body was later found. Then there were the things he said to Carly's dad, details about her remains that hadn't been made public. It was like he couldn't help himself, letting bits of the truth slip out. And his digital tracks sealed it. Forensic techs showed how he'd wiped location data from his phone between September 18th and October 2nd, right when Carly vanished. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a cover-up. Even the missing person flyers he'd handed out turned out to be a twisted piece of the puzzle. The photo of Carly he used had been edited. Background changed, subtle but deliberate. Why mess with something like that unless you're hiding something? The prosecution said it was all part of his game, pretending to search for her while knowing exactly where she was. Newson didn't flinch through any of it. Sat there stone-faced, denying everything, swearing he had nothing to do with it. His defense tried to poke holes, saying there was no hard proof, no fingerprints, no DNA at the scene, no video of him doing it. But the pile of circumstantial evidence was too big to ignore. The jury took their time, days of deliberating, picking through every detail like their lives depended on it. When they came back, the courtroom felt like it might collapse under the tension. Carly's parents, Steve and Lorraine, sat there gripping each other's hands, barely breathing. Then the word hit. Guilty. It landed like a thunderclap. After years of wondering if they'd ever see this day, Newson was convicted of Carly's murder. The judge handed down 27 years, with 20 before parole even came up. A sentence meant to send a message. Monsters like him don't get to walk free. But it wasn't over. James Cunnin still had to face his own reckoning. Accused of helping dump Carly's body, he'd lied to the cops, faked alibis, wiped his own phone to protect Newson. His trial was separate, but the prosecution came down just as hard. They proved he'd been in on the cover-up, and in November 2022, he was found guilty too. 7.5 years, with parole possible after 4. For Carly's family, the convictions were something, but not enough. No verdict could undo what happened. Carly was still gone. Her kids, William and Cadence, would still grow up without their mom. At the trial's end, Lorraine stood up, tears streaming, and spoke from a place of raw grief. "My girl should be here, laughing, holding her babies, living her life. Instead, she was taken in the worst way possible. No justice brings her back, but maybe now she can rest." The room went quiet. The fight was won, but the bigger battle, against violence against men like Newson, kept raging on. The aftermath, a family forever changed. The courtroom cleared out, leaving behind a hollow silence that pressed down on Carly McBride's family. The gavel had fallen, the verdict delivered. Justice, they called it. But it didn't feel like justice. It didn't lift the weight off their chests or erase the nightmare they'd lived through. Carly was still gone, and no amount of prison time could bring her back. For Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams, the pain was a relentless storm. Losing a child was a kind of hell no parent should ever know, but the way Carly died made it worse. Brutal, merciless, at the hands of someone she'd once trusted. The trial had laid it all bare. The fractures on her body, the lies her killer spun, the careless way he'd dumped her in some remote patch of dirt like she was nothing. Those details looped in their minds, a cruel movie they couldn't stop watching. Then there were Carly's kids, William and Cadence, left to grow up without their mom. They'd spent years waiting, little hearts clinging to hope she'd walk through the door one day, too young to grasp the darkness that had taken her. Now they'd have to carry a heavier truth. She didn't vanish. She was stolen, torn from them in a way so violent it was hard to even say out loud. Steve and Lorraine felt that loss double, not just for themselves, but for the grandkids who'd never know their mother's voice, her hugs, her dreams for them. It wasn't just the big moments they mourned, like never seeing Carly get married or hold her own grandbabies one day. It was the small stuff, too. No more of her laughter bouncing off the walls at Christmas. No more late-night phone calls just to chat. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet evening stung with her absence, a constant reminder of what was ripped away. Carly's death didn't just break her family, it sent cracks through everyone who knew her. Friends who used to laugh with her over coffee now carried an ache that wouldn't leave. In Belmont, where she'd lived and fought to start fresh, the community grieved a woman who'd been determined to rise above her struggles. Her story shook them awake, a harsh lesson about how fast jealousy and control can turn deadly in relationships. For the cops who worked the case, it was one they couldn't shake. Detectives who'd poured years into finding the truth admitted it got under their skin. Even the hardest of them, folks who'd seen too many crime scenes to count, said this one hit different. Reading the reports was bad enough, but seeing what was left of Carly, knowing what had been done to her, left scars on them too. Justice might have been served, but it didn't erase the horror they'd uncovered. What kept them up at night, though, was how close this all came to slipping away. If those random passers-by hadn't stumbled on that shallow grave, if Carly's remains had stayed hidden, Newson might have walked free. For almost 2 years he'd played the part of the heartbroken boyfriend so well, crying to the cops, pleading for answers, that even some of Carly's friends bought it at first. He'd almost pulled it off. That was the scariest part. This wasn't some messy crime of passion, a split-second explosion of rage. It was cold, planned, deliberate. From the second he killed her, Newson had worked to wipe Carly off the map, covering tracks, scrubbing messages, spinning stories. He didn't just take her life. He tried to erase her entire existence. If her body hadn't been found, she'd be another missing person on a poster. No trial, no justice, nothing. Even locked up, Newson wouldn't own what he did. In his last statement before sentencing, he stood there, voice flat, and swore he was innocent. "I get the verdict, Your Honor, but it's not me. I've done everything right. Talked to the police, followed the rules. Someone else did this." Nobody bought it. Not the judge, not the jury, not the cops who'd spent years unraveling his lies. Lorraine wouldn't give his words any space in her heart. As she left the courtroom, her voice was steady, edged with steel. "I don't ever want to hear his name again. He's nothing to me now. He took my girl, but I won't let him take another second of my life." The case was done, but the hurt wasn't going anywhere. In the months after, Carly's family pushed to keep her memory alive, not for how she died, but for how she lived. They teamed up with domestic violence groups, sharing her story, warning others about the red flags of abuse, the slow creep of possessiveness that can turn fatal. Because Carly wasn't just a victim, she was a mom, a daughter, a friend, a woman who'd fought hard for a better life. And though hers was cut short, her story wouldn't be forgotten. The legacy of a life lost. Time marched on, but for Carly McBride's family and friends, the world felt stuck. Her brutal murder left a wound that refused to heal, a constant ache that no amount of years could dull. The courtroom images lingered like ghosts, the horrifying details of her injuries, the chilling deception of her killer, the 2 agonizing years of not knowing. Carly was gone, and nothing could undo that. Yet those who loved her were determined her story wouldn't fade into obscurity. Her parents, Steve McBride and Lorraine Williams, bore a grief that could have broken them. Instead, they turned it into purpose. They spoke out about domestic violence, about the subtle dangers too often overlooked. They explained it wasn't always black eyes or broken bones. Sometimes it started with control, jealousy, isolation. They hoped Carly's story could be a warning, a lesson to save someone else before it was too late. In the years after her death, Carly's name grew beyond a tragic headline. It became a rallying cry. Groups fighting intimate partner violence pointed to her case as a stark reminder of the hidden risks women face daily. Justice had come for Carly. Her killer convicted, her body found. But so many others never got that. Too many women vanished, their families trapped in an endless purgatory of unanswered questions. Carly had been one of the lucky ones, if you could even call it that. Her family got answers, a rare closure in a world where so many cases stayed cold. But Steve and Lorraine wouldn't let that be the end of it. They wanted change, education, prevention, anything to stop another woman from meeting Carly's fate. They joined support groups speaking to young women about the warning signs of controlling partners, urging them to see the red flags early. Still, the pain never really left. It hung around like a shadow. Carly's kids, William and Cadence, were growing up without their mom. They'd never know her hugs, her laughter, her dreams for them. Instead, they'd carry the heavy truth that she didn't leave them. She was taken, stolen in a way no one should ever endure. Steve and Lorraine felt it too, every day. The empty chair at dinner, the birthdays that slipped by in silence, the voice they'd never hear again. Even with Newson locked away, justice didn't feel like enough. What was closure, anyway? Could it bring Carly back? Could it erase the years of waiting, wondering, hurting? Could it fill the gaping hole she'd left? For her family, real justice would have been Carly alive, raising her babies, chasing the life she'd fought so hard for. But life doesn't work that way, and no prison sentence could rewrite the past. Newson kept claiming he was innocent, despite the mountain of evidence that put him behind bars. He appealed his conviction, clawing for freedom. But in March 2024, the courts shut him down. His 27-year sentence stood firm. No early release, no second chances. He'd rot there while the world moved on without him. His accomplice, James Cuneen, was another story. Convicted for helping dispose of Carly's body, his case dragged on. 2 trials ended in hung juries, and now, in 2025, he faced a third. A frustrating, drawn-out ordeal that should have been settled long ago. Carly's family didn't waver. They'd fight until everyone involved paid for what they did. Beyond the courtroom battles, the headlines, the years of anguish, one truth stayed sharp. Carly was gone. Her absence darkened the world for everyone who loved her. Her story stuck with those who followed it, a grim reminder of what people are capable of. But even in that darkness, there was light. Carly had mattered. She wasn't just a victim, not just a news story. She'd been a mom, a daughter, a friend, a fighter. Though her voice was silenced in the worst way, her story kept speaking for those who couldn't. Steve and Lorraine made sure of that. They told it over and over, keeping her alive in their words. William and Cadence would grow up knowing their mom fought, not just for them, but for herself, for the life she wanted. They'd hear how hard she loved, how deeply she cared, and the world would remember Carly McBride, not only for the way she died, but for the way she lived. Her laughter, her strength, her stubborn streak, they'd outlast the headlines. Because even though she was gone, her spirit wasn't. It lived in her kids' smiles, in her parents' mission, in every life her story touched. That was her real legacy, the one no one could take away. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime cases that uncover the darkest secrets and most chilling mysteries. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, because every story deserves to be told.